If you were stuck in jail, who would come to bail you out, and how much could they afford? A Minnesota nonprofit has $35 million at its disposal to do just that.
Tonight, though, new questions about who the Minnesota Freedom Fund is bailing out and whether it's making the system more fair or the streets less safe. Here's Tom Lydon of the Fox 9 investigators.
It may just be the closest thing to a get-out-of-jail-free card. Jaleel Stallings, charged with attempted murder, prosecutors say he shot at a SWAT team during the riots in May. Someone paid $75,000 cash to get him out of jail. Darnica Floyd, charged with second-degree murder for stabbing a friend to death. $100,000 cash, and she got out of jail too. There's Christopher Boswell, a twice-convicted rapist, currently charged with kidnapping and sexual assault in two separate cases. $350,000, all cash, and he walks out too. All three would probably still be sitting in jail if it wasn't for the Minnesota Freedom Fund, the group that paid their bail, no questions asked.
Last time I was down there, said, we hate it when you bail out these sex offenders, was exactly what they said. And
Greg Lewin is the group's executive director, who says it's not about the crime, it's about the system. In Minnesota, 60% of the jail population is just waiting for trial, innocent till proven guilty, with black people incarcerated in Minnesota jails at nearly 5 times the rate of whites. Native Americans, 11 times. It's one of the largest disparities in the U.S.
I often don't even look at a charge specifics when I bail someone out. I'll see it after I pay the bail because it's not the point. It's just that it is not the point. The point is the system that we're fighting.
And now the Freedom Fund has a whole lot more money for that fight. Prior tax returns show in a good year they pull in about $100,000 in donations. But after the police killing of George Floyd and supportive tweets from Hollywood celebrities, they've now received more than $35 million in contributions.
We initially got many raised eyebrows, especially when we ramped up our activity from paying $1,000 a day across however many cases we could to now closer to up to $100,000 a day. Some very raised eyebrows from our bankers.
Not just bankers, but others who wondered where all the money was going and who was accountable. Most of the protesters arrested were quickly released or only received citations.
So how many of the protesters do you think you helped?
The answer is probably closer to a dozen in terms of direct bail actions.
Before the killing of George Floyd, Freedom Fund bailed out 563 people with an average bail of $342. Since Floyd, the fund has bailed out 184 people, but the average bail is much, much higher, $13,000. Freedom Fund is also assisting 400 people with what they call pretrial justice, court fines, legal fees, even lost wages. About 83% of those bailed out, the group says, have been black, indigenous, or people of color.
A lot of people, are saying F the police right now. Those same people, quite frankly, in that tendency should be thinking F the courts and F the jails as well, because that is part of the same cycle.
There has to be some scrutiny on this.
Jeff Clayton is the executive director of the American Bail Coalition.
Have you noticed a recent pattern in who they're bailing out?
Well, it's got to be violent criminals because that's all that's left. There's nobody left. There's no peaceful protesters for them to spend this kind of money on.
The Bail Coalition recently wrote a letter to the Hennepin County Sheriff, threatening to sue if it didn't release the names of inmates bailed out by Freedom Fund.
A judge or a prosecutor should know if it's Vladimir Putin's henchmen posting the bond for this guy, or if it's a co-conspirator, or if it's part of organized crime to bail the person out.
The bail bond industry is highly regulated, but come to find out, when a third party like Minnesota Freedom Fund comes here to the jail and pays all cash to get someone out, there is no public record of that transaction. There is no transparency. We were surprised too. The only way the Fox 9 investigators found out about these Minnesota Freedom Fund cases was to dig deep into the individual court records to find a notation that Freedom Fund was paying for the bail. Otherwise, we wouldn't know. And who else is going to do that work?
Under Minnesota's Constitution, there should be no excessive bail. But that doesn't mean it's affordable. Bail is not punishment. It's meant to guarantee the defendant comes back to court and ensure the safety of the victim and community. A judge has 3 choices, really. Release a defendant without bail, set bail with conditions like drug testing, or unconditional bail. And this is where the bail bond companies come in. If bail is $10,000, let's say, the defendant or someone else must pay 10% of that up front, $1,000, non-refundable. And there must be a co-signer who assumes responsibility for the rest of that $10,000 if the defendant skips out. A bail bondsman usually wants a co-signer with a bank account, credit history, or home to put up for collateral. All things that can work against the poor and communities of color.
I've seen bail bondsmen attempt to position themselves as kind of the answer here, but it is like a payday lender calling themselves a community resource. It is a predatory industry.
But the ones who are making big money isn't necessarily the bail bond shop on the corner. It's the insurance underwriters who get a 10% cut for underwriting the loan and usually pay out less than 1% of their revenue. By comparison, home and auto insurance payouts are 40 to 60% of revenue. The American Bail Coalition, by the way, is funded by those very insurance underwriters.
In this case, there's no oversight because there's no regulation. They're basically acting as a bail bondsman, but not for profit. But there's no regulation whatsoever in the state of Minnesota and everywhere else except for New York State.
Freedom Fund points out that not everyone they bail out is charged with a crime. Domestic assault charges against this man, who we're not identifying, were dismissed. But then not everyone they bail out comes back for trial. Donovan Boone was charged with breaking into the home of an ex-girlfriend and choking her. She thought she was going to die. Freedom Fund bailed him out for $3,000 cash, and he hasn't shown up for court since.
But you mentioned some community groups are also concerned about some of the people who have been released?
That is a relatively new, as of last week, conversation that's getting started. We'll see where it goes. I'm curious to see where lines get drawn by those folks.
Freedom Fund is already drawing that line, convinced that releasing those charged with even violent crimes will make the scales of justice more balanced. The question is whether we should all get to see the finger on the scale. For the Fox 9 investigators, I'm Tom Lydon.
Well, the Freedom Fund has also set up an advisory council to get more feedback from the community groups on who they bail out. Last month, the Freedom Fund paid $850,000 to get people out of Twin Cities jails. If defendants show up for trial, Freedom Fund will get almost all of that money back.